Hello everyone, welcome to this eighth talk on semiotics of the body. And today I would like to talk about body, death and de-ritualization. As some of you might know, I have dedicated long years to the study and research from a semiotic point of view of processes of ritualization, and I have been teaching on semiotics of ritual in some anthropology schools back in Venezuela. So let's talk today about this, I think, very interesting phenomena, where I would like to demonstrate how in some cultures and societies a process of de-ritualization has started. And I think that we as semioticians have to pay attention to these meaning-making processes in order to establish and to find there some way of modelization, of finding a logic of meaning processes in this kind of behavior in contemporary societies. So let's begin talking about this this difficult process, which is assisted suicide. And so I have as a corpus a small part of a very interesting documentary about assisted suicide. But before, I would like to go through different modalities of suicide that we have seen in recent years, and in all years too. So just to frame this reflection, I would like to quote one of the persons who took the decision of having an assisted suicide in Switzerland. And just like in kind of joke, before dying he said, "One day there will be protocols for occasions like this, suicide. There'll be a card you can get saying, 'Congratulations on your forthcoming death.'" So let's talk about that. The ritualization of death is a universal phenomenon. All known cultures have developed different symbolic strategies that aim to deal with the end of life, with the transit to qualitatively different worlds, with grief, and with the members of the group that are still alive. The symbolic efficacy of these strategies is beyond any doubt. In this sense, rites contribute to the organization of relationships with the living, family and friends, but also with the extraterrestrial world, whatever idea you may have about that. There are numerous studies on the different rites that have been developed in societies, both ancient and modern, to explain how these symbolic strategies embody the values and beliefs that groups and societies profess and practice, including in particular those that have to do with his conceptions of life and death. In the research that we have been developing and whose partial result we present here today, we will try to address an aspect, or better, a mortuary practice that has been gaining a greater presence in recent years, in which we believe to identify, according to our hypothesis, a transformation in symbolic work in the Western world. To develop our hypothesis, we will use a documentary as a working corpus in which the death of a person through the so-called assisted suicide is presented. But before going to the specific analysis, I will review some history and data about suicide. Just to have frames, you have just to have context. One of the fundamental changes occurred in the last centuries in relation to the conception of body, death, and life is expressed through the so-called assisted suicide, a practice accepted in a growing number of countries in the world, where the right of the individual is legally admitted to end their life, with the assistance of medical professionals as long as some basic requirements are met. Perhaps the most famous cases of assisted suicide were started by Dr. Jack Kevorkian in the United States. He claims to have helped 130 people to die. More recently, the Dignitas clinic in Switzerland has become famous. Here, more than 1,100 people have ended their life, either because they suffer from incurable diseases or because they suffer excruciating pain, or, as in many cases, both. But also about 20% of the people whose deaths were recorded in Dignitas paid for assisted suicide about £10,000 to put an end to life fatigue, the tiredness of a meaningless existence, and the lack of alternative. Dr. Kevorkian used to say, I quote, "If we can aid people into coming into the world, why can't we aid them in exiting the world?" That was part of his philosophy. From an anthroposemiotic perspective, what is it that interests us about this growing phenomenon, almost unnatural, in which suicide on the one hand and death on the other reverse and contradict the traditional historical sense of sacredness of life? What interests to us as semioticians this process? This strong and growing trend, what does it reveal about the transformations of our societies? On what social, anthropological, and semiotic mechanisms are these new practices based? What interests us in this phenomenon is what appears to be a set of operations that we could describe as ritual desemiotization of the meaning of death and life, a phenomenon that goes beyond a simple anthroposemiotic resemantization and that demands the revision and formulation of new concepts so that we can better understand one of the most important phenomena of the organization of the values and beliefs of the human beings, cultural and social development, and of the contemporary world. I'm talking about rituals. Rituals is one of the most symbolic and important actions created by men all over the history of humankind to try to communicate ideas and vision of certain event on their life, on their social and cultural life. Let's talk a little bit about type of suicide that we can see today and even before today, in order to have a context in which to place this new kind of suicide that we call assisted suicide. In human history, there are different ways that suicide has acquired for purposes that go beyond the cessation of biological life. Suicide in modern time was always a solitary, private, arbitrary act that was condemned by the great religions and by the laws of many countries. So it was a cause of shame for the subject who committed it and also for their families. These were acts devoid of ritualization and little symbolic display, except for the letters that some people who commit suicide leave. In his investigation of suicide attempts in Maracaibo, in Venezuela, José finds that only 2.46% of the cases studied by him involved suicide notes. All were left by women. Brandon's study in Caracas found suicide notes only in 5.9% of the cases, of which 9 were female and 3 were male. In the United States, that percentage rises to 33.9%. People who, before committing suicide, wrote and left letters explaining their decision. The second type, one of the most shocking types in recent history, have been suicide for religious reasons. Among them, the most famous is the suicide type called Bonzo style, introduced by a group of monks in Vietnam in June 1963, when the Buddhist monk Thi Quang Duc immolated himself in the middle of a Saigon street. Since then, suicide for religious reasons have not ceased. We only need to look at what takes place almost daily in the Middle East. In this kind of suicide, fire acquires a strong symbolic value. Religious suicide is a highly ritualized type of suicide, loaded with a dense symbolism, both religious and political. Here you have the immolation of the bodies Thi Quang Duc, 70 years old, who burned alive in the street of Saigon, as I said, in 1963. This is a very famous photo taken by Malcolm Browne from the Associated Press agency. There is another example that occurs in India. We see here Jampa Jeshi, a Tibetan in his 20s, that caught fire to protest against the occupying of the Tibet, but he did that in front of the Parliament of India in New Delhi. Another very common type of suicide today, particularly in the Middle East, is a political suicide that generally implies not only the destruction of one's own life, but also that of others, whether they are enemies or not. If the Bonzo suicide was religious but also political, they didn't take their own life harming other people. But in the political suicide, particularly in the Middle East, there is a kind of suicide, bombing suicide, for example, that looks to harm also other people. Here is a clearly manifestation of political interest in political communication, in political symbolism. Immolation in markets of Middle Eastern countries are almost daily events that seek not only to eliminate and intimidate the enemy, but also to make a political statement against the occupying soldiers and against the entire world. Generally, these are ritualized actions in that they are accompanied by a speech or at least a proclamation or a slogan that gives symbolic meaning to the actions taken. A third type, very frequent in this recent economic crisis in Spain, is what we could call civil suicide, through which a particular situation that causes citizens to despair is protested, such as that affecting people indebted to banks who were forced to leave their home because they couldn't afford the monthly payments. It is a phenomenon of great social but also religious impact, as Spain is one of the countries with the largest percentage of Catholic people in the world. In these cases, the context acquires a dominant semiotic dimension, and in addition, suicides are committed in the middle of a legal ritualization characterized by actors like notaries, sheriff, police officers, etc., that privilege the values of mercantilism and bank property. Here I have some example. For example, a 50 years old man from Cordoba who took their life before member of courts came to take his home because he couldn't pay the monthly payment at the bank. But also we find here example like this, example of this kind of civic suicide. In India, for example, a woman and her 5 daughters immolate themselves in India because of husband abuse. This abuse came as mistreatment from the husband to his wife because she didn't have sons, male sons. So this, because of this mistreatment, the woman and her 5 daughters decided to commit suicide. And also, more recently, we find that what I call show suicide, which takes place in tourist places, shopping centers, and historical monuments, where the public's attention is sought and where the traditional vision of suicide as a private, anonymous, and hidden act is changed. In these cases, the person who commits suicide chooses a very crowded public place. The now frequent suicides in the malls involve the expression of a message, maybe against hedonism, against consumerism, that makes suicide an act of communication. In other cases, a tourist monument is chosen as place of committing suicide. An example, suicides on the Eiffel Tower, 1 per year. The New York Academy of Medicine created the term tourist suicides because 10% of people who commit suicide in Manhattan are tourists. For example, another example, tall places with the highest number of suicides are the Golden Gate Bridge in the United States, 1,200 suicides, 20 per year. Niagara Falls in Canada, 2,780 suicides, 25 per year. The Prince Edward Viaduct in Canada, 400 suicides. The Eiffel Tower, 400 suicides. Beachy Head in England, 20 suicides per year. Another type of taking their own life is what I call the cyber suicide. And you can see many examples, like in Sweden. Men commit suicide live on the internet. A 21 years old Swedish man took his own life while broadcasting with his webcam on a portal to hundreds of users who could not believe what they were witnessing. But in Japan too, a Japanese man broadcast his suicide live online. And also in Florida, a 19-year-old man commit suicide before his webcam. In Thailand, Jong Thai broadcast her suicide live on the internet, 24 years old. Many young people committing suicide through the webcam. Here in Canada, a very famous case in Canada because it was related to cyberbullying. A 15 years old girl that took her life online as a protest by the fact that she had been suffering from cyberbullying. Now let's talk a little bit about ritualization and de-ritualization to see a little bit where this concept of ritualization comes, because we know the term rite, ritual, etc. And ritualization is a term introduced by Ronald Grimes in 1982, where he said, I quote, "When meaning, communication, or representation become more important than functional and pragmatic purposes, ritualization has begun to occur. So when this process of meaning, communication, representation begin to be more important than pragmatic uses, than pragmatic acts, the ritualization has begun to happen." In 2000, 18 years later, the same author, Grimes, added that ritualization is, I quote, unformed, undefined material from which the rite emerged. And he said, I have proposed an intermediate or transition category, a limbo zone called ritualization, in which the activities are tacitly ritualistic. End of quote. Ritualization is thus a complex process through which a group crosses the boundaries between practical, technological, and utilitarian behaviors and symbolic, allegorical, and imaginary communicative behaviors begin. It is not always easy to mark exactly when such borders have been crossed and at what point a behavior or set of actions has become a rite, which implies a certain formality. The rite implies a certain formality, a set of belief, a collective participation, and shared symbolic codes. Usually, dying, mourning, and wake are accompanied by ritual processes of a great symbolic burden, among them extreme unction, prayers, weeping, vigil, use of ritual objects like candles, crucifix, images, etc. These are acts of great symbolic density in which not only believers participate, but even non-believers resort to secular symbolism, in particular expression of friendship, solidarity, company, and grief, like hugs, condolences, cries, silences, etc. If there are ritualization processes, if there are ritualization processes, is it possible to think that there are also de-ritualization processes? That is possible to think that there are strategies and action designed to create a conception of death and life in which they no longer have the sacred, different, special, extraordinary character that the cult and the rites have given them? In order to answer this question, we examine the documentary of the assisted suicide of Mr. Peter Smedley, 71, which was taken from the documentary Choosing to Die, broadcast by the BBC in London and produced and directed by Charlie Russell, and in which the British writer Terry Pratchett, who suffered from Alzheimer's, presents testimony about this way of ending in life in patients suffering from severe and incurable diseases. Peter Smedley was a millionaire hotel owner who 2 years before his death developed the disease known as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, The diseases, I quote, this is diseases that originate when cells of the nervous system called motor neuron gradually decrease their functions and die, causing a progressive muscular paralysis of mortal prognosis. In its advanced stage, patients suffer a total paralysis that is accompanied by an exaltation of the tendon reflexes, resulting in the loss of inhibitory muscle controls. As assisted suicide is prohibited in Britain, Smedley traveled to the Dignitas Clinic in Switzerland, where more than 1,200 people have been assisted in their dying processes. So I'll show you the part of this documentary that, as I said before, was aired at the BBC in London. It's a very sensitive video, so I ask you please take your prevention, since it is always difficult to see somebody dying. The analysis of the full documentary, I, of course, cannot show you the full documentary, which lasts for 1.5 hours. But the analysis of the documentary, in particular the process of carrying out suicide, shows us what we call a de-ritualization of death, or, if prefer, an anti-ritualization. Generally, the process of dying covers steps like this: sickness, old age, accident, despair, agony, death. But what I did was to review our previous research on death, wake, and mourning. And we highlighted some symbolic characteristics that mark in general death, wake, and mourning. For example, from the sound point of view, these processes, death, wake, and mourning, are characterized by silence, by the predominance of silence. From the point of view of movement, there is slowness. Movement from the people who goes to a wake usually walk slowly, try not to make noise. From the point of view of lighting, we see darkness or half darkness. From the chromatic point of view, we usually see dark colors. Traditionally, for example, when wakes took place at homes, some mirrors were covered with black pieces of clothing. So the predominance of dark colors were some of the symbolic presences in wakes and mourning. From the point of view of clothing, people tend to use demure clothes. And from an choreography point of view, we see crosses, candles, and flowers. So we can compare those traditional characteristics that I have just mentioned with those we see in this video. These elements do not appear, or appear with less intensity and relevance, in this form of death, which is assisted suicide. What we see, nonetheless, it's a sort of micro-rites that still are there, but are usually secular micro-rites. For example, before taking the poison, Mr. Medley drank coffee with his wife and with the nurse who was going to give him the poison. And Terry Pratchett says, it's as if they came here for tea. Is this micro-rite of drinking coffee that appears in this documentary. But also appears the micro-rites like greetings, farewells. You see, for example, Mr. Medley, after taking the poison, had the time to thank the nurse that gave him the poison, take the time to say goodbye to Mr. Terry Pratchett, and also to the filming team there. So this sort of micro-rite persists there, but, are a sort of secular micro-rites, like congratulations, and etc., etc. But there is no funerary objects, funeral speech, prayers, laments, etc. There are no funeral attire, and there are no particular color codes in this process of assisted suicide. So that's why I say that here we are seeing a sort of losing all the great rites that usually accompanies the dying, the wake, and the mourning. If de-ritualization occurs it is because in postmodern society, that's my hypothesis, marked by consumerism, hedonism, and individualism, there is a constant erosion of the great symbolic systems, religious, political, social, and of the rituals that renew them. According to my hypothesis, in this society where we live now, characterized by hedonism and individualism and consumerism, is a constant loosening of the great symbolic system and of the rituals that usually renew them. As Tamayo Acosta says, postmodernity would have made, a quote, a radical renunciation of myth and symbol that cease to be meaningful, end of quote. With the death of God and the crisis of the symbolic universes, Vatimo says, a vacuum, an emptiness of symbolic systems, and an erosion, an impoverishment of ritual systems develop progressively. That trend has marched along with the transformation of death into socially silent, as Hanus said, or as Freud pointed out in 1915, I quote, "We have tried to eliminate death with our silence." End of quote. So, if the ritualization occurs, it is because there is also a loss of the symbolic density of funeral rites. And I quote Aloe, "The rites has ceased to belong to us, thereby losing its significance. On the one hand, it has become professional because funeral companies have appropriated the management of the ceremonial sequences of the entire process. On the other, the Catholic tradition rigidly maintains the sequential reproduction of the acts, leaving a reduced margin for non-prescribed actions." End of quote. In suicide actions, we can see three main stages. As we have seen, suicide has gone, first stage, progressively from being a solitary, private, shameful, denatured, and socially reprobated act to an extremely symbolic, ritualized, public, socially tolerated act. And finally, to an act in the process of de-ritualization, in which loses its symbolic density and, despite itself, sometimes acquires a new spectacularity. I talk about spectacularity when referring to the suicides committed on malls and towers and big public touristic spaces. So these three stages, suicide being solitary and private, first. Second, public, social, spectacular suicide. And now, third, this kind of assisted suicide are three stages that mark some way or another what societies are thinking about death, about mourning, and about the rituals that used to accompany them. So that's what I call private suicide are-ritualized, spectacular suicide ritualized, and assisted suicide de-ritualized. These three stages, I would say, need to be studied and clarified in a deeper research. But I think that these are a way to begin with analyzing these processes of how we and societies and cultures are relating to the dying body. I have come to my conclusion. In certain way, I would say, the de-ritualization of death that we observe in assisted suicide is similar to that which occurred with suicides in the times when religious condemned such acts. By denying them religious funerals and the rituals and symbols associated with them, the religions made people who commit suicide inexistent, meaningless beings. Their bodies were no longer the bodies of children of God, divine creatures created in His image and likeness, but bodies lost to that which is sacred, excluded from the benefit of the sanctified earth. As you know, suicide people were no longer permitted to be buried in sacred cemeteries. In the case of assisted suicides that we have reviewed, we observe an absence of the symbolic and ritual strategies that societies and human groups have developed to face the transit between life and death. Assisted suicide claims for itself the condition of a pragmatic, utilitarian act, devoid of symbolism and ritualizations, which seeks to put an end to pain and suffering because they are meaningless. Supporting them will not extend life or allow recovery. That same condition of pragmatic and utilitarian act is evidenced in the fact that in this type of death, the family, group, and social condition of the same has been lost to vindicate and privilege the individuality and loneliness of the subject, to reduce and limit the traditional participation of friends, family, and acquaintances. Finally, we could ask ourselves if the de-ritualization that we observe in the case of self-inflicted death is nothing but the propitiatory scenario of new ritualizations and unborn symbols, semiotic reorganizations that express new conceptions of life and death, in which will be necessary to reveal old or create new symbolic behaviors that attenuate the nothingness of death and give it new senses. Elias, for example, is not optimistic about it. I quote, "There are still no new rituals that can correspond to the norms of present sensitivity and behavior, and that can therefore lighten the overcoming of critical life situations." End of quote. It is not, of course, about the disappearance of ritual systems, which are a constitutive part of cultural and social life, but certainly we wear and tear of traditional symbolism of death requires the renewal of ritual practices, so that they give answers to new questions and new needs. Pratchett and Colgan are more optimistic about the new rites to come and think that someday there will be also protocols and greetings and solidarity cards for assisted suicide. Thank you.